Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about the absolute worst industry in Victoria 3 when you are caring about efficiency per construction. So as long as you have peasants, you're generally going to be caring about efficiency per construction rather than efficiency per worker. Once you run out of available workers, you'll care about how efficient you are per worker. But this industry is really bad. It's so bad that it's worse than ports and railways. It was kind of the worst industry before this patch, and then it got twice as bad after this patch, or half as good or half as useful in terms of efficiency per construction, and that is electrical generation. Electrical generation has a kind of semi-buff, a semi-nerf, and it effectively got buffed per worker, but super nerfed per construction, such that it is not actually going to be good to build it. And this is what we're going to be exploring today. And this is also going to be our first time exploring looking at industries from the perspective of looking at it as an input to other industries, which isn't something that we've explored too much before, because in my mind it hasn't been, while it's been something we haven't taken a close look at, it hasn't been particularly important. But power plants are so bad that even though they feed into really, really good PMs, it's still not worth using them because they are so inefficient. And so because of this, electricity as an input good should be viewed as something that is really, really bad to have as an input, just because the industry is so inefficient. Now, of course, for this, we are going to be consulting spreadsheets. And of course, if you have a child under the age of 38, you need to ask them to leave the room. You need to throw them down the stairs, tie them to a tree, whatever it takes. Just make sure they don't see what comes next. So first up, let's talk about the power plants and what's changed. Well, they used to, just in terms of interpreting the spreadsheet very quickly, every single PM or every single building is going to have the input goods that go into it. And for this column, we have the input goods times the value at base price of all those things. And that is where we get this number here. So for hydroelectric plant, 490 is the value of the inputs. The outputs, in this case electricity, are multiplied by their base price to get this. And then we subtract inputs from the outputs, and this is how we get net value added. Of course, for everything that you do, you want to be looking at your opportunity cost, and there are two opportunity costs we are focused on. Efficiency per week of construction. So in that case, we take the net value added and we divide by weeks of construction it takes to build the thing, and then efficiency per 100 workers, which is, again, taking the net value added and dividing by the number of workers it costs to employ. Now, what has happened with the power plants in 1.9 is that, roughly speaking, the amount of net value added was cut in half. So the building is half as good in terms of providing net as it was before. And then what also has happened is that the number of workers required to operate it was cut from 5,000 to 1,000. So it was cut by 80%. So the building is around 2.5 times more efficient per 100 workers as it was last patch, but it is half efficient as what it was in terms of efficiency per construction last patch. And last patch, it was already the worst and least efficient thing per construction that wasn't producing infrastructure. This is important to emphasize. The railways, experimental trains, not that efficient per construction, but we're building them for infrastructure, not really for their outputs. Otherwise, it would be a very, very bad industry. In fact, this is less than half the value of the next worst thing that is not producing some level of infrastructure. If we come into industrial goods and we look at the munitions plants, to my knowledge, this is the second worst PM. And this is producing per week of construction 17.5 worth of net value. And so the electrical or the power plants are producing an absolutely teeny tiny amount of value per construction. It's an 800 construction cost building, it employs 100 people, and it barely produces any net value. And because this is so low, it actually is going to make it that a lot of PMs that look good, like the textile mills where we have sewing machines, and then we can upgrade to electric sewing, which you might be able to infer uses electricity, we will see that we jump efficiency per construction from 40 to 50, but this jump is such that it is not going to be worth it for us to build electricity just to turn these on, because the cost of building the 800 cost power plants just to turn this PM on is going to eat into the value we are getting here, the marginal value, such that it's not going to be positive. And so you don't actually build the industry. Another very important note is oil-fired plants start to actually look decent, 20 efficiency per week of construction. This is like, hey, this seems pretty good, and maybe we're starting to get into a zone where things feel good. No, this is when you look at it from a perspective of efficiency per oil input, this is the least efficient PM in the entire game, and it is not close. I believe diesel trains might be the next least efficient, and what it's doing is producing more infrastructure as well. Per oil input, it is producing marginal 10.4 worth of value. Just as a sort of comparison with the best, if I recall correctly, with the new automotive industries, how much value you are getting per oil used, you are getting 400. That is 40 times the efficiency per oil. So if you have even the slightest bit shortage of oil, or you are using and triaging oil PMs in any sort of way, the absolute first one to go is going to be the oil-fired power plant, I think. But you can also look at it the perspective of you're saving yourself from the abysmally bad coal-fired power plant that maybe in some sort of sense it's worth eating this really, really disgusting inefficiency. I don't think it is, and this is not an analysis we are going to get into, but for all intents and purposes, we're going to look at what the oil-fired power plant gives, but I don't think it's worth turning on. We're just going to look at it for the sake of completeness, but the way we should consider it is we really only have two power plant PMs that we are really going to end up using. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at this from an input perspective in terms of how much value we're getting. Alright, so this is a new spreadsheet that is going to allow us to calculate marginal value of deciding to go into a particular production method that has an input that we don't think is that good, in this case electricity, although you could do this analysis for other PMs. We're not going to do it because I don't think motor industries is so bad that it warrants this type of analysis, but we are going to be looking at electricity's PM marginal value gain per construction relative to building more buildings of the previous PM. And what we mean by that is for, this electric sewing, we can choose to build power plants to turn on electric sewing, or we could just decide to build, hey, we're just going to build more sewing machines buildings, right? And for every, because this is 600 construction, right, which is going to be 30 weeks of construction, for every power plant we build, which is 40 weeks of construction or 800 construction, we can build 1 1/3 textile mill. And so what we are going to be getting with a lot of these, or with the entirety of this sheet, is the difference between the value you gain from turning on the electricity PM by virtue of building this power plant minus the alternative of just not turning on the PM and just building more of the other industry. And what you will notice here is there is a whole lot of red. Alright, so let's unpack a little bit what's going on here. We are looking at the marginal gain of turning up the PM. So in the case of electric sewing here, we see the marginal gain is 10. If we take a look at the PM, we see that the difference between sewing machines and electric sewing is indeed 10. So this is how much we are gaining for every time we get to turn up the PM, or the production method. This is amount we are gaining, and 40 is the amount that we would get if we would just build more of the previous building, or build more of the building, in this case the textile mills, and just use the previous PM. Now, of course, a very important factor here is the electricity that gets used in each of these PMs. Because we do not need one power plant for every upgrade, we need instead much, much less. And so different PMs will have a different amount of output. On the first PM hydroelectric plant, we will have an output of 25, on coal-fired power plant of 50, and of oil-fired plant, we will have 80. What we are doing in this spreadsheet is we are assuming, when calculating these values, we are assuming a ratio of base value, which is we are going to have the same amount of electricity output and the same amount of electricity used. And so in the case of the electric sewing, we will be, if we are on coal-fired power plant, we will be assuming that we are building 1 power plant for every 5 textile mills in order to get this equation. For the best case scenario, which it features really loud cars outside, holy snapples, we are going to be assuming that we are pushing everything to the complete max, and we are doubling the amount of buildings we build relative to just keeping electricity at base price. And so if we have an output of 50 electricity and input costs of 10, we will be building 10 of these textile mills for every power plant. And this leads to much better situations because even though you consider that electricity is more expensive, since electricity is so inefficient per construction, building half as many power plants is going to be better. And you see that we will be doing better on each of these things as well. We have some other things in here just to make all the equations work, but this is fundamentally what we are doing between these two situations here. It's important to emphasize, I think, that we aren't looking at the bad case scenario because the normal case scenario is so bad. I think it's just gratuitous to look at the bad case scenario, but you can have situations where you go over the amount of electricity you have supplied by more than 2x, causing you to have shortages, which decreases output. And you can also have you can, for example, in the instance of we only need 5 electricity, you can build something, you can have one logging camp, build a power plant, and then now you have way too much construction invested in this power plant, and this is a really bad scenario. We're not looking at those because it's unnecessary, because the PMs are so bad for electricity. Into the equations, we have built in a few assumptions that I think are worthwhile to make the calculations a little bit more dynamic, where we are assuming the amount of power plant throughput you get. And so in the case of cities that are built up pretty high, you're probably actually going to have a decent amount of power plant throughput, and changing this will wildly change your outcomes, right? If you increase power plant throughput, you will make the power plants look better. We have it set at 5 because I think that for the most part, when you're first implementing power plants, you're going to have a relatively low value. But if you assume that you have, kind of more, if you assume that you have 3, suddenly things start to look quite a bit better, in that not everything is red and there's a little bit of green in there, other than the oil-fired power plant, which we're kind of ignoring because we know we don't really want to use the oil PMs here. But switching this back down to 5%, also, as we increase industry throughput, this is going to make it, generally speaking, worse. I think it does it in a little bit of a weird ways where some of them get better, but as you increase throughput, just building more of the industry rather than building the electricity is going to be better. Throughput increases both input goods and output goods, so it will increase your demand for electricity, but this will decrease the marginal value, generally speaking, of the thing. You can see here value of 12.5, and then if we get a ton more throughput, it becomes better just to build more of the building. The reason we have this at 70% is because we are kind of assuming that you will have a combination of 50 stack buildings, building to economies of scale. You get that technology at the same frame that you also get electricity. This won't always be the case, but also you will have companies. And so a lot of industries will have something like 120, 110%, throughput, and then a lot will have something much more modest. If we look at 20% throughput, you notice some of these get to poke in on having positive value, especially electric engines as a production method. And so this is going to be quite a bit better. And then finally, if you turn on electricity, your pops will start consuming it for their heating need. This is going to be, let's actually pull it up. So, as we can see here, electricity is part of the heating needs. Notably, it has a high weight along with oil. And so this is got a couple of dynamics. It'll kind of decrease your need for oil to some extent. And this is not something that we have really evaluated because it will replace it as a need. But also, as soon as electricity appears within a given location, your pops will start demanding it. And when they start demanding it, they will consume it. And so this actually decreases your ability to use it for PMs before you run a shortage because your pops are eating it. And as you build more electricity, your pops will consume more of it. Now, this is a constant need that doesn't really have that high a buy basket, so we're not predicting that electricity is going to be particularly high. Once it reaches its equilibrium level, it will just stay constant. It reaches it, I think, at 10 SOL, going up and up and up, then decreasing slightly. And so what we are assuming for the sake of the spreadsheet is just a pop consumption of 5%. I really don't know if this is quite correct, but if this gets bigger, things start to look way, way, way worse, and this is something that is worth considering. And so if you notice in your games and you copy the spreadsheet and you create a copy and you fiddle with it yourself and you notice your pops are demanding more than 5% electricity, you can plug and play. We're just assuming the 5% electricity for the sake of our evaluation that we are doing here. We are going to save this depeasanting category for last because this is kind of the nail in the coffin, and it's also the most complicated thing. But now we're going to talk a little bit about the different industries that consume electricity, which are going to be have a little bit of nuance between them. Starting off with sawmills, this is the only thing that is a resource industry. So generally speaking, your throughput on it is going to be a lot worse unless you have a company, and with less industry throughput, it will often actually be reasonable to turn on or reasonable to go for the electricity, as long as the consumption of electricity doesn't really end up being that high. This can be something that you would reasonably want to go for in a lot of cases, but also you eventually will run out of ability to expand logging camps. And if you have softwood that is even the slightest bit expensive, or is more expensive than normal, this will get better for electricity. Coming into game real quick, another thing that's important to point out, I think, is that it just feels a lot better to be running electric sawmills. And the reason why, well, it doesn't feel good because electricity sucks, but to the extent that it feels easier from a micromanagement perspective, it is easier to just turn on electric sawmills on everything and then turn on focused hardwood on everything, because your ratio of softwood to hardwood is such that you can't do focused hardwood everywhere, or it doesn't really feel like you can, and so this requires much less micromanagement when you get onto regular electricity to just go for everything on focused hardwood. This is not optimal, but I do think as a play pattern it is much more, it feels a lot better in terms of micromanagement, rather than, in some places you're going to be focused hardwood, and then in other places, depending on price, you're going to be focused softwood, this type of thing, so that your softwood and hardwood price has an equilibrium stability, because the trade-off when you go for focused hardwood is an even trade-off. Hardwood is double the base price of softwood, so trading double that for that is going to be a good exchange, but regular hardwood production, you lose net value, and so as a micromanagement thing, it does feel a little bit better. Coming back into the spreadsheet, oh no. So we have here electric arc process, which is in a lot of scenarios going to feel particularly bad because it uses so much electricity, as does the motor industries also using 30. But I think of both of these, there's something worth noting that in particular, you tend to build up both your engines and your steel in places where you have a big industrial base, where you might be using, a manufacturing throughput, especially early on, and you, by virtue of having an enormous amount of need for these things, might end up getting up to 50% power plant throughput. At which point in time, things start to look a bit better here, and you start pushing, kind of an equal value and this sort of thing. But also, in the places where you push economies of scale on both steel and engines, it tends to be less places, high push for the steels and engines. And in scenarios like these, you often get crimped for labor. An important thing to emphasize, and you get crimped for labor just in that one state, but not overall into your entire nation. And so in individual industrial zones, what might be the case is that you will actually reach a point where you are going to be caring more about efficiency per worker earlier on in these types of places, and so the types of places where you tend to build steels and engines will be to the types of places you run out of workers, where now being more efficient per worker is something that you care about. And since you already have really high economies of scale in that state, you don't really care that you're being inefficient with your construction, because you're getting up to 50% throughput on the power plant, and you're getting up to actually something more like 110% throughput on the buildings and stuff like this. And so this is going to be something that is contextually, sometimes you will use electric arc process, but in a very isolated way that we're looking at it right now, it just feels really, really awful because of the 30 input. Same with the electric engines, but the electric engines tend to perform a little bit better. You can see with our assumptions, they actually have positive value here in both the average scenario and the best case scenario. And a big part of that is they produce 22 net value, and then they go up to 47 net value when you upgrade them. This is an absolutely massive jump. This might be one of the biggest jumps of a PM, in terms of, or it's the biggest one in terms of electricity, but also just relativistically speaking, you're getting a more than 100% jump between steam engines and electric engines. And because of this, motor industries are going to be something that you maybe want to target a little bit earlier if you actually decide to push electricity in some states or this type of thing. Brine electrolysis doesn't have anything too crazy to write home about, other than this patch, it got nerfed. It used to be better. If it was the better version, this might actually look good, but it's not, and so the early PMs for explosives got buffed, brine electrolysis got nerfed, is probably going to be, in a lot of situations, not worth using, especially if you are building explosives where you have sulfur and you're not pushing economies of scale to 50 on those explosives, which I think is probably a lot of contexts, depending on how much sulfur you have available across your nation. In those kinds of situations, it's not going to be worth pushing, because also, just generally speaking, in your market, you won't demand that much explosives, and so the point at which you hit your level 50 explosives, max economies of scale, is relatively low. And so with the low level of throughput and you not building tall in an area where you can really push for the power plant throughput, up to 50, it's going to be harder to reach a situation where this is going to actually be starting to look net positive. And the Depeasanting net positive is one we kind of care about. But let's continue on here and look at the next example of electric sewing, which is interesting because it's a split PM. You produce both basic clothing as well as luxury clothing. If basic clothing starts to get more expensive than luxury clothing, any PM that's going to add more basic clothing, in this case electric sewing, is going to be pretty valuable, because you having the prices equalized will be the situation in which you make the most money of both basic clothing and luxury clothing. But also, if you wanted to push up SOL, this is a reasonable one for pushing up SOL. Coming into game real quick, if we take a look at what our pops are demanding, very often one of their high needs is going to be clothing, especially in the lower and middle strata. Because clothing is one of their needs, pushing down the price of clothing will raise SOL. So if this is something we care about, this can be a reason, outside of making more money, that we would want to turn on the PM for electricity for this, because a lot of the value, when we are looking at the value of just building more textile mills instead of going for electricity, a lot of this value is coming from the luxury clothing. You can see here, relatively speaking, this is, like 30 or 40% of the value of this. And so if we want all the value concentrated in basic clothing, going for electricity can make a little bit more sense. Coming into the next one here, or coming back, radio production. This is the only way you get radios. If you want to use radio PMs, you have to do this. So that it is, I think, probably the worst and most inefficient one is completely irrelevant. If you want to use radio PMs, you're going to need to do this. But an important thing to note is the same idea happens when you build radios in terms of the needs, where your pops are going to start demanding radios, and they will demand quite a bit more radios than they will, generally speaking, I think, than they will electricity, because this is a luxury item, and this doesn't have the flat constant need. This is instead an exponential need. You can see in here we will have luxury items, and so especially if you're building them in places that house a lot of capitalists, you will end up having a lot of need for radios. And this is a little bit tangential because we're not talking about radios, but just know that you're going to really need to overproduce more than this, and this is actually a cost of turning on the radio PM that is maybe one that is a little bit harder to see. You can also target where you turn on radios in specific places, and maybe you look to turn them on in places where you don't have upper strata pops. This is a bit of an interesting thing, because the upper strata pops are the ones that are really scaling up these exponential needs, right? And so if you don't have as many upper strata pops, you will hemorrhage less electricity to feeding pop needs, and so maybe more rural areas that are producing electric services are going to be better places to lay down the radio buildings if you're bifurcating them at all. Like if you have some producing radios and some not in terms of your electrical industries. All right, next up is electrical railways, which actually just kind of performs the best in terms of what it is doing. A big part of that is it is only consuming 8 electricity per railway, and on top of that, unlike the sawmills, you basically can only build one railway. It's 800 construction. The sawmills are 200 construction, and so electric railways will often actually just look the best, despite electric engines like going up by an absolutely massive percentage, which electric railways doesn't. But on top of this, the opportunity cost, just building another railway, is not really that valuable, because if we take a look, the railways aren't really good PMs. And so when we compare the prospect of building something with a bad PM to building something with a slightly worse PM, it's really not going to be that big a deal. Now, we can also take a look at infrastructure, and so let's pull that up in game. Alright, so let's take a look at the trains PMs as they relate specifically to infrastructure. So on regular steam trains, we will get 25 infrastructure. On electric trains, we will get 30 infrastructure. At first blush, since both railways and power plants cost 800 construction, it might seem like, hey, why don't I just build another steam train? Well, for every single power plant you build, you can turn on multiple electric trains. And so what this means is that, for the most part, you going on electric trains is actually reasonable, but this is a pretty big investment for you to focus on specifically, because it's just barely useful with the generic PM. We're going to be pushing electric railways specifically, and it's just very, very marginally better than steam, and we are going to have to get 1, 2, 3 techs to turn this on, and then if we want it to feel good, it's going to take 4 techs. This is a lot of investment for electrical generation, just barely kind of passing the line of feeling good. But with 48 electricity, we will be able to turn on 6 electric railways, right? And with that, we will be able to produce more infrastructure per construction than just building more steam trains. We can do that on hydroelectric plant if we very come close to running a very near shortage. So if we have like plus 70% price on our electricity. However, we are not going to be able to exact seize plus 70% price consistently, and so this means you're going to either be running shortages or you are going to be producing less infrastructure than just building more steam railways. It's only on coal-fired power plant that you are going to just generally look better and going to want to use the electricity PM, but this is going to be a situation where you also at this point, you need to have a level 3 plus railway for this to feel good, because if you build the power plant and you just have a level 1 railway, now you have a power plant that you have constructed for just 1 level of railway. That's not going to feel good, and that's not going to be what you are going to be wanting. So there's like kind of a little bit of uncomfortable situations, but electric railways can be worth it to turn on. Also, very notably, it is going to employ a very similar number of people. The PMs on electric railways or railways do change things a little bit, but this is also a base 1,000 employment level, just like the power plant. The final industry we have is urban streetlights, which is actually probably the best electricity PM, but we can't really evaluate it in the same way we are the others. This is going to be not a marginal difference. This is not a marginal difference. This is the efficiency per week of construction of building electricity just for purposes of turning on urban streetlights. And as you can see, it's not all that bad. 25, 50, this is going to be values that you get. And if you just want to build electricity just for turning on urban streetlights, this will kind of be okay. The PM is very, very strong relative to the PM before it, because efficiency per worker, you're going to be going from 36 to 84. As you can see, there's no efficiency per construction. You don't spend construction building these, although you could look at it from the urbanization perspective where you buy urbanization, but very often these won't be fully employed, but the amount of value you will be getting is going to be going up by 120 every time you turn these on, but they are going to require very, very little electricity each to turn on. Only a need of 3, and so this is going to be quite strong. Important to emphasize, this is not marginal value where this is 50 and it's like 50 times as good as an oil-powered fire plant. This is just efficiency per week of construction. To provide a little bit of context here, if we look at textile mills with sewing machines, that is going to give 40 efficiency per construction. If we are going to look at, let's see, another industry that is one we are looking at for electricity, radio production, 42 efficiency per construction. If we look at some of these industrial goods, we will see steel mills where electric arc process 37 efficiency per construction. If we aren't using the electricity PM, steam engines, not very good per construction, as you can see, and the boom booms, 42. And so you can see a lot of these PMs, although the really good one is, of course, the resource industry in the logging camps, which are going to be very efficient per construction with 90. But the point being is those will be the types of opportunity costs you pay relative to building something like a power plant just to turn on this PM. And so it's going to be a little bit better than kind of a lot of the industrial PMs once you have coal-fired power plants, but it's not going to be way, way, way better. It will kind of regulate the electricity maybe a little bit better. And so if you have really urbanized areas, starting to push a little bit of electricity into it is probably going to be better than, a different alternative in terms of investment. Although you're going to need to have relatively expensive services for this to feel good. And often service prices kind of get dumped. So it's maybe going to depend a little bit on service prices, because that is, in terms of the PM, what you are earning into. So this here is the electricity PM. You can see 5 services up to 10 for turning on electric streetlights. What this is going to mean is that it's going to be highly contingent to how good this is based on the price of services. If services get expensive because you have a ton of capitalists in an area, then this would actually make electric streetlights look really good. However, we're looking at the urban center and the home counties. It's very nearly fully employed, that is fair, but very often you get a ton of urban center levels, and they do employ up, and they tend to collapse service prices. If service prices get collapsed, what ends up happening is that we will be making a lot less by turning on the electric streetlights than we otherwise would. We're still getting infrastructure, so it could be worth it from that front. But when a place like the home counties is running minus 7% on service prices, this is going to make it kind of feel worse for pushing electricity just for going for the services. You can see here there is 1,400 plus an additional 5-ish hundred. There's very nearly 2,000 levels of ownership buildings here, and the service prices are still at minus 7%. And so in practice, this is not going to be that profitable, even though on paper it is going to be looking kind of nice here. We can decrease this effectively by 7% in the particulars of the home counties for thinking through things. But if you have like minus 50% on your service prices, right, then the value per week of construction of this would be 12.5, and it'd be 25 here. And then suddenly going for it on coal-fired plant starts to not look like it really makes all that much sense. But if you have really expensive services, the other direction would be true, right? And so what you're going to have is maybe targeted single states where it's going to look like it makes a lot of sense to build electrical power plants, especially in states where you're running out of labor, because we probably should be emphasizing this pretty consistently all throughout. Your efficiency per week of per 100 workers on the power plants is okay. Alright, so let's talk about the crypto bros, the peasants. Peasants have a lot going on, and we're not going to fully unpack it. We're going to link a video where we do a detailed analysis on peasants, as well as the value of depeasanting. But the main idea here is that there are going to be a variety of things that stimulate your economy when you move a pop from being not a peasant to a peasant, and building power plants is really, really inefficient at moving pops from being not peasants to peasants. An example of this is the dependent wage here. 0.004 per pop when you are on peasants, and they use these to buy goods. When they buy goods, this increases the price of the good. As the price of the good goes up, you get more opportunities for profitable buildings because you can build a furniture manufactory and make more money. Overall, aggregate higher prices in your market will give you more opportunities for profitable buildings, and so this is generally speaking a good thing, and the depeasanting pushes up these prices. Also, another factor that pushes it in this direction is going to be, if we take a look at the census data and we hover over a need after scrolling to the right a little, we will see this 0.05 consumption factor for peasants. Peasants They have the same buy basket as a normal pop, but only 5% of their purchases reach the market. Now, as crypto bros, they buy this with fake money, and we're not going to go into too great a detail, so they kind of have some free money that goes into this, but overall in the aggregate, when you turn them into not peasants, they will be consuming more actual goods that reach the market, and so you get more opportunities for profitable buildings. And this is where the value for peasants is coming in. Now, this value is not very large. If we take a look at a different industry here, we can see that we have a Depeasant adjusted efficiency here. And we also have efficiency per week of construction. So adjusting for the value we get from peasants, it's only going to be an additional 3.1 per week of construction on the tooling workshop here, which is not a lot. But coming back into our spreadsheet here, we are looking at things at the marginal level. And so when we are just barely getting under or over whether or not something's worth it because the electricity PM is so bad, this really makes a big difference when we consider that we will, for the, taking a look, for the power plants, the employment level of these is just going to be 1,000 pops each. This is a really, really big deal. You can see here, here's the distribution of pops, but just employing 1,000 pops means we spend 800 construction, and then we only depeasant, right? We only depeasant 1,000 pops. And this is going to be really, really noticeable, like coming back over into the spreadsheet we have here, in the instance of the logging camps, because those only require 10 weeks of construction instead of 50. So this means we could build instead of 40. We could build 4 logging camps in the time it takes to build a single power plant. And so this means we could depeasant 20,000 pops or 1,000 pops. And so when you factor this in, the value of depeasanting, again, if you have peasants, this is valuable. If you don't have peasants, electricity is fine. But if you do have peasants, suddenly a situation that looked really, really good for you with coal-fired power plant, in the best case scenario, pushing electric sawmills, suddenly looks catastrophic. And every single one of these starts to get pushed negative. The ones that get pushed negative less are going to be the ones that are higher construction costs. You can see that is most of the industries, with the exception of clothing and electric sawmills, but it is very solidly negative, assuming even prices. And so it will look a little bit better towards this best case scenario, but it's not a big margin between average scenario and best case here. And so it's still going to be negative, even if we consider a sort of best case scenario. And again, we're not considering worst case scenarios here. And so, all in told, when you do consider the depeasanting on top of everything, it really doesn't make sense to, if you have pops available, if you are not running out of pops and you have available workers, you have peasants, it just doesn't make sense at all to push electricity. Once this number reaches 0 or starts to get low, or in individual states you run out of pops, building electricity is great. But before then, it's not worth it, despite there being a ton of PMs that are really, really good in a sort of vacuum, just looking at their net efficiency, not taking into consideration that their inputs aren't very easy or valuable to get in terms of electricity. Alright, so we looked at electricity, but there are other inferences you can kind of draw from this type of analysis, because this is going to hold true for other input goods. Electricity, input per week of construction, 6.5. But there's other things that aren't very efficient per week of construction. For example, the steel mills, with 18.8 on blister steel. And so this actually makes it so that, wrought iron tools versus steel tools, wrought iron tools looks a lot worse than steel tools when you have to consider, or you take into consideration, the fact that steel is less efficient per construction. This difference starts to decrease, right? And now steel is going to be relatively okay, per worker. And so the very similar type of analysis plays out for both steel and motor industries, where by virtue of these things having being relatively inefficient, anything that uses them as a PM or as an input good is actually going to be a little bit worse. But also, the reverse is going to be true as well, where if we consider, industries that are really efficient per week of construction, like something like an iron mine on condensing engine pump, 67, or even something that uses wood as an input good, these are going to be much more valuable by virtue of forcing you to use or create buy orders for a more valuable industry. And so if we think of back to considering steel, steel uses as its input a whole lot of iron, very efficient input, and a whole lot of coal, very efficient input. And so this actually makes steel better than it looks like as well. An important thing to note with this type of analysis as it relates to electricity is electricity will use coal, but it also uses engines, which is generally not that efficient. And so by virtue of forcing you onto more engines, this is not something that we like really want to have. If we take a look over here at the input goods, we can see that they will be consuming a ton of engines. This is going to be one of their big consumptions. And then early on, they will be consuming wood and coal. And then later, they will be consuming just coal and then oil. Again, the oil one's probably not worth using, but in the net, it's probably a little bit bad in terms of its inputs by virtue of the engines, where for this PM, base price of coal is going to be 30. This is going to be 600 worth of coal, and then base price for engines, I think, is going to be 60, and so this is 360, so around 1/3 to 40% is going to be, in terms of inputs, engines. But you can conduct this type of analysis along the similar veins, when you're looking at something, and I do think that this is the first time we've really looked at input goods, and you can extrapolate into other things. But with that said, that's going to be the video here. We talked about electricity quite a bit. The TLDR is don't use electricity if you still have peasants. If you have peasants in a state, it is better to build other stuff other than electricity, and don't build the electricity except in the very narrow sorts of circumstances, like it might make sense if you already have a high level of railways to build them for electric railways, and it kind of makes sense a little bit for urban streetlights if you have enough levels of the urban centers, and also, very importantly, have expensive services. If you like this video, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Now, these spreadsheet videos generally take a lot longer to put together and to do, both thinking through the things and then setting up all the spreadsheets. So if you did want to support these videos in particular, they tend not to get as many views. You can also put a super thanks on the video, or you can subscribe to my Patreon, or you could just like, comment, subscribe. That is also effective. If you do a super thanks, though, and you are interested in a particular type of spreadsheet, feel free to put it down there. This isn't a guarantee that I'll do it, but I'll probably be more likely to do it. But other than that, you guys all have a good one.